Okay, well, welcome to the fourth part of First Book of Samuel. Today we'll be going over chapters 17 through 21. And last time, if you remember that Saul, the Lord had taken away his spirit from Saul and he was demoted. He's no longer king in the eyes of the Lord, and David had been anointed king by Samuel. So now in chapter 17, I think is one of the most known stories of the Bible, which is the story of David and Goliath. So we're going to go through that tonight. And so let's start in chapter 17. And it says, "Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Succoth, which belongs to Judah. And they camped between Succoth and Azekah in Ephes Damim. Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up in battle array to encounter the Philistines. So the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, while Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with the valley between them." Because remember that during this time of Saul and David, their worst enemy is the Philistines. Okay, and even though they had won some battles, they were still having war going on between them. In verse 4 it says, "Then a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span." Now, many people have translated that as Goliath being 9 feet tall. Now, that was the idea that people used to have, but as they have discovered through archaeology, they think that it was mostly 6 feet. Anywhere between 6 and 7 feet, which is really not that tall, because today we have, especially those basketball players, most of them are at almost 7 feet tall. So, but again, you have to remember that the Jews, the Israelites, and the people in that area, the Semites, are not very tall people. Okay, so finding someone that's 6 feet tall or 7 feet tall, they consider them very tall. Or sometimes they even call them giants, which I think is not the best adjective, but either way, they were tall. Verse 5, "He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was clothed with scale armor, which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. He also had bronze greaves on his legs and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. His shield carrier also walked before him." So Goliath is not only tall, and he was probably also a husky, big man. The armor that he's wearing, I mean, you looked at him, he was probably pretty scary. And not only that, he had a lot of weight on him. And it says in verse 8, he stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel and said to them, "Why do you come out to draw up in battle array? Am I not the Philistine, and you servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will become your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall become our servants and serve us." So what's going on? It was a military strategy during this time that when two armies came together to fight, they would choose what they would call a champion from one side and a champion from the other. And the two champions would fight. And whoever won between the two champions, they understood that the God of that champion was in favor of that army, of that group of warriors, and that was like a forecast that they would win the war. So if two champions came together, whoever won was considered that they were having divine help. And it was like a way of saying, well, then this group is going to win, and they then they fought. Usually first two champions and then everybody else. But in this case, Goliath says, he already gives a way, he says, if you win, then we'll be your servants. In other words, there's no need to fight. But if I win, then you become our servants. Okay, so that was the issue that was going on. But what happens? It says in verse 9, if he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we'll become your servants. Verse 10, again the Philistines said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we might fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So Saul, who's the leader, who's the king, should be the one fighting against Goliath. In other words, because remember they picked him and chose him as king because they saw him to be a tall, handsome man, and they thought he was going to be a great leader. So basically, but what's going on? The king and his people, both of them are afraid. So remember, they're standing between two mountains and there's a valley. And here's Goliath on one side taunting them and saying all these things. And it says in verse 12, now David was the son of the Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, whose name was Jesse, and he had 8 sons. And Jesse was old in the days of Saul, advanced in years among men. The 3 older sons of Jesse had gone after Saul to the battle, and the names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and the second to him Avinadab, and the third Shammah. It's interesting that Eliab would be Eli, my God of Father. Okay, so my father, my God, the Father. Avinadab, Avi is also my father. And Nadab, I think, has to do with enlightenment or something like that. And the third, Shammah, Shammah means there. Okay, so the names all kind of in a way tell you what's going on. In verse 14 it says, David was the youngest. Now remember that most of the time the Lord chooses the youngest son to fulfill his purpose, when it should be always, according to them, it should be the firstborn. Now the 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's flock at Bethlehem. The Philistine came forward morning and evening for 40 days and took his stand. So imagine they're waiting there 40 days, and each day, morning and evening, this Goliath would show up and speak, who knows what, all these terrible things against the army of Israel, and they're all there like shaking, and oh, when is this going to stop? No one dares to confront him, and still waiting for someone to show up, to be another champion, to fight against Goliath. So remember also that 40 is the numerical value of the letter Mem. And the symbol of the letter Mem is Mayim, waters. But in this case is chaos, chaotic waters. So basically this is telling you that this situation is a chaotic situation, is disrupting the shalom of the people of Israel. And it says, verse 17, then Jesse said to David his son, take now for your brothers an ephah of this roasted grain and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to your brothers. Bring also these 10 cuts of cheese to the commander of their 1,000, and look into the welfare of your brothers, and bring back news of them. For Saul and they and all the men of Israel are in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. So it was understood that during this time when war was happening, the people, the relatives of the soldiers, would send supplies to make sure that they were okay, they weren't lacking anything. So Jesse is sending some supplies to his sons through David. And also a gift for the commander, I'm assuming that, like say, the commander of where the unit where the 3 sons are. So David arose early in the morning and left the flock with the keeper and took the supplies and went as Jesse had commanded him. And here we see the responsibility that David has, that even though he has to go to his brothers to bring his supplies. He's taking care of the sheep. He just doesn't leave them there and goes. He makes sure that someone's going to take care of them while he's out there. So he's thinking about the responsibility of those sheep. And he came to the circle of the camp while the army was going out in battle array, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines drew up in battle array, army against army. Then David left his baggage in the care of the baggage keeper and ran to the battle line and entered in order to greet his brothers. As he was talking with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine from Gath, named Goliath, was coming up from the army of the Philistines, and he spoke these same words, and David heard them. When all the men of Israel saw the man, they fled from him and were greatly afraid. The men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who is coming up? Surely he is coming up to defy Israel. And it will be that the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel." So what Saul is doing, he's telling the people, if any man desires to go against Goliath, has the courage to go against Goliath, this is what I will do to him. He will give him a daughter, one of his daughters, to marry, and make his father's house free in Israel. Now it's understood that basically whoever did this, the household of that person, most likely would be free of taxes. Okay, so by going against Goliath, whoever was able to do that, the reward would be to marry one of Saul's daughters, and also the household and all the descendants wouldn't have to pay taxes. It's most likely because it says house free in Israel. And remember, they're not slaves, so most likely had to do with contributions to the king. Verse 26, then David spoke to the men who were standing by him, saying, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God?" So what David is seeing is, who's this Goliath that he comes, he's an uncircumcised. In other words, he's not in covenant with the God of Israel. So basically, what's the big deal of going after him? What's going to happen whoever goes after him? In verse 27, the people answered him in accord with this word, saying, "Thus it will be done for the man who kills him." So to every person that David talks, they give him the same answer. Whoever goes against Goliath will get a daughter from Saul, and his whole household will be free. And he keeps asking to see what's going on, why no one has done anything against this Goliath. Verse 28, now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger burned against David, and he said, "Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? Listen to this, I know your insolence and the wickedness of your heart. For you have come down in order to see the battle." Do you think this oldest brother had issues with David? Don't you think that especially after he got anointed as king by Samuel, because he's the oldest, he's the firstborn, he was not chosen. So he's angry, he's jealous, he's got something against poor little David. And look at the way he treats him. Wickedness of your heart. What you do is those sheep. And that was the first thing that David did, left somebody to take care of the sheep, because he says, those few sheep, like in other words, they're few and you just left them there in the wilderness? But David took care of them. In verse 29, but David said, "What have I done now? Was it not just a question?" So can you imagine the oldest brother and the little, what did I do now? That sibling rivalry. But I think here is even more than that. His oldest brother is probably jealous because David was the one that was anointed, the youngest one. Verse 30, then he turned away from him to another and said the same thing, and the people answered the same thing as before. So David is confirming over and over again with everybody, how come nobody goes against this guy? You're going to get a wife. Your whole household is going to be free. Verse 31, when the words which David spoke were heard, they told them to Saul, and he sent for him. David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Then Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, while he has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant was tending his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went out after him and attacked him and rescued it from his mouth. And when he rose up against me, I seized him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. So what's going on? David is jealous, is zealous for, how this guy, this Goliath, is treating the army of the living God. He says, come on, people. And David said, Yahweh, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and may Yahweh be with you. Then Saul, listen to this, then Saul clothed David with his garments and put a bronze helmet on his head, and he clothed him with armor. David girded his sword over his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. So David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. And David took them off. He took his stick in his hand and chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook. So here, what is Saul trying to do? Saul is so afraid of this Goliath that he's not going, but he puts on his armor, who probably, if the people, when they saw the armor, say, oh, there's Saul with, no. So he puts on his stuff, and David puts, and he's a shepherd boy. Can you imagine? He's putting all this stuff on, and he's like, he can't even walk. He's never tried them. He's never been a warrior like that. So he takes them off, and he takes his stick in his hand and shows him 5 smooth stones. 5, the number 5 has to do with Torah. It has to do with the kingdom. The number 5 has to do with the kingdom. And he says, stones from the brook. Why the brook? The brook has living waters. Remember that the 40 days represents chaotic waters, but the brook represents living waters. And stones, remember, stones is where the commandments were written. And number 2, the stones also represent YESHUA. He's the rock. He's the stone. And put them in a shepherd's bag, which he had, even in his pouch, and his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Why a sling? Because that was the favorite weapon of shepherds. Because remember, they're defending their sheep, and so what they would do? They would take a sling with a stone. Anytime a wild animal came by, they would scare him or hit him with that. That was their weapon. So if this is the weapon of choice of the shepherd, and David is a shepherd, he's had a lot of experience. He's an expert with this thing. Then the Philistine came and approached David with the shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy with a handsome appearance. The Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? Remember that dogs during this time were not seen as like the way we see dogs today. They didn't care for dogs. They saw them as wild animals. They saw them as a nuisance. And so, so he's like, something that doesn't have value. So basically Goliath's saying, you think I'm a dog? You come here with a stick? Because he doesn't see that it's a sling. He just sees a little piece of steak. And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistines also said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of Yahweh of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day Yahweh will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you, and I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that Yahweh does not deliver by sword or by spear. For the battle is Yahweh's, and he will give you into our hands. Now, do you think that's confidence? Do you think that's trust? Do you think he's not seeing with his physical eyes, but with his spiritual eyes? I mean, here's this supposedly giant who's so powerful and so macho and so, and everybody's afraid of him except David. David's a little shepherd boy, he's a young kid. I don't know how young, 15, 16, 17, 18, I don't know, but still he's young against this guy who's been a warrior all his life. But he's trusting in something that no one else trusted, in the name of Yahweh, the Elohim of the armies, of Yahweh Sebaot. And another thing something that we need to consider is that he's seeing his enemy the same way that Jonathan saw the Philistines. Remember when Jonathan went up by himself with his armor bearer against the whole garrison of Philistines? He said, if it's the will of Yahweh, we will succeed, even though it's just you and me. So he had that faith, the same faith that David has. Verse 48, then it happened when the Philistine rose and came and drew near to meet David, that David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand into his bag and took from it a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. And the stone sank into his forehead so that he fell on his face to the ground. Most likely he hit him right between the eyes, which is a very sensitive spot in the forehead of any individual. If you hit somebody right in that area, he's knocked out. What they call the third eye. But right, it's a very sensitive spot right here. So most likely, but it says the stone, he sent the stone so hard, because I was reading, the commentary said that the velocity, they would take the sling, well, what they would use, some of them would use like a pouch, and they would spin it in the air really fast, and then they threw it. And they were making the comment that the speed of the stone, the way with the speed and the velocity and everything that was going on, could go up to 150 miles per hour. Okay? So do you think David knew what he was doing? So he knew, and he threw that sling, that stone, and that thing flew to the point that it stuck inside the forehead. And this humongous guy with all his armor fell flat on his face. And it says, thus David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. And he struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in David's hand. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword, in other words, Goliath's sword, and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. So what I'm assuming is that the stone knocked him out, but he finished killing him by cutting his head off with Goliath's own sword. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Why? Because what I was saying, champions came together to fight against the armies in the name of their gods. Whatever champion won, everybody understood that that God was stronger than the God of the other group. So, I mean, here you have Goliath with all his armor. He's a huge guy. He's the champion of all the Philistines. And here's little David with a slingshot and beats this Goliath. And so what they're saying, my goodness, he doesn't even have a sword and he already won. So they think, if this is him, this God of Israel, this God of David, we need to leave. So all the Philistines just ran, because what are the odds of this happening? So they understood that this was a divine thing that David was able to succeed. And it says, Verse 52, the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the valley and to the gates of Ekron. So now they're moving. Now the army of Israel is moving. Now that David has killed the Goliath. And the slain Philistines lay along the way to Sha'arim, even to Gath and Ekron. The sons of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines and plundered their camps. Then David took the Philistines' head and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his weapons in his tent. Now when Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this young man? And Abner said, by your life, O king, I do not know. The king said, you inquire whose son the youth is. Now you have to remember that prior to this, David had been going to Saul to play the harp. But he doesn't remember, because he probably had a lot of musicians that came into his presence to play instruments and to calm him down. So he doesn't remember who David is. Or maybe he's having a little bit of Alzheimer's, I don't know. So when David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the Philistine's head in his hand. Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. Now it came about when he had finished speaking to Saul that the Saul of Jonathan was knit to the Saul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. Now unfortunately, a lot of people take the verses relating to David and Jonathan and say that they were homosexuals. And that is because of the lack of knowledge of covenant. And again, I understand that Jonathan felt a strong attraction to David because they both had the same spirit. They both believed in God when nobody else did. Jonathan went against the Philistines by himself in faith and in trust in Yahweh, the same way that David did against Goliath when nobody else did it. So they both have that same strong faith and trust in God that no one else has. They're able to see something that no one else can. So that's why their souls were connected, because of the same faith. And so it says, Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. In other words, David. Verse 3, then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt. And the reason for that is, if you know anything about covenant rituals between people, especially during this time, when you made a covenant of this sort, it was saying like, you are me and I am you. Whatever happens to you, I'm there for you. Whatever happens to me, you're there for me. And so by giving him all these different parts of his garments, each one represents something. So this is something that happened between covenants, like between brothers. For example, I don't know if you remember when you were a kid, you would do like a blood thing with a friend. You would each cut your fingers or something, or, and you mix your bloods. And trust me, in our ignorance, that is a true covenant. That is an everlasting covenant. Wow. So that's called the blood covenant. So even though it doesn't mention this here, they probably did also something that had to do with exchange of blood. So the covenant that they're doing, as we'll read later on, is an eternal covenant between Jonathan and David. Anything that whoever outlived the other would take care of his descendants and of his family, make sure that nothing was missing, that they would take care of them. So this is a lifelong covenant between Jonathan and David, because they have the same spirit, the same loyalty to Yahweh. Verse 5, so David went out wherever Saul sent him and prospered. And Saul set him over the men of war. And it was pleasing in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. It happened as they were coming, when David returned from killing the Philistine, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. Apparently this was a custom. It was tradition for this to happen when the men came back from war and there had been victory. Remember, like also happened at the Red Sea, that Miriam with all the other women. And usually it was something that the women did, because the women were the ones that stayed in their homes, that stayed in the cities. So when they saw their men coming back, they would go out and run out with their tambourines and their music and everything, singing with joy. And in verse 7 it says, the women sang as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Then Saul became very angry, for this saying displeased him. And he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, but to me they have ascribed thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. So he was jealous. He was pouting. He thought, no, now this is the time where he's going to take the kingdom also. Because remember, Saul knows that Samuel anointed someone to be king. Verse 10, now it came about on the next day that an evil spirit from God came mightily upon Saul, and he raved in the midst of the house, while David was playing the harp with his hand as usual, and a spear was in Saul's hand. So look at this scene. David has a harp, and Saul has a spear. Well, David is playing for him to be relieved of the spirit, which basically he was delusional. He was probably having what today could be diagnosed as a psychosis. David is playing the harp, but he has a spear in his hand. He's paranoid. Has paranoia. And it says, Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped from his presence twice. Now Saul was afraid of David, for Yahweh was with him, but had departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from his presence and appointed him as his commander of 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. David was prospering in all his ways, for Yahweh was with him. So when you put Yahweh first in your life, he will prosper you. He will also put you first in everything. But you have to trust completely in him for everything. And so that's what David was doing. And that's why we know that David was a man after God's own heart. When Saul saw that he was prospering greatly, he dreaded him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, and he went out and came in before them. Now that love David, what that means, it's in legal terms. What it means is that they were loyal and they served David. Has to do with loyalty and service to David. Then Saul said to David, here is my older daughter Merav. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be a valiant man before me, a man for me, and fight Yahweh's battles. For Saul thought, this is what his intention, my hand shall not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. But David said to Saul, who am I, and what is my life or my father's family in Israel, that I should be the king's son-in-law? His humility. He doesn't see himself worthy of being the son-in-law of King Saul. And King Saul wants to marry him and then send him out to battle to see if the Philistines kill him. So it came about at the time when Merav, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel the Meholathite for a wife. I don't know where these people come from. Anyway. Now, Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. When they told Saul, the thing was agreeable to him. Saul thought, I will give her to him that she may become a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. So anything that he does for David is with the intention that he gets killed. And so Michal, when he says, let her be a snare to David, so there was already something wrong with this girl. And we'll see that later on, what happens between him and Michal. And it says, Saul thought, I will give her to him that she may become a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David, for a second time you may be my son-in-law today. Then Saul commanded his servants, speak to David secretly, saying, behold, the king delights in you, and all his servants love you. Now therefore become the king's son-in-law. So Saul's servants spoke these words to David, but David said, is it trivial in your sight to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and lightly esteemed? So his concern is that he's poor. What kind of dowry can I give to the king? I mean, how can I repay him for this? The servants of Saul reported to him according to these words which David spoke. Saul then said, thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire any dowry except 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemies. With what reason? Now Saul planned to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. He's asking him to fight against 100 Philistines, and as a trophy, bring back 100 foreskins. Because it used to be that body parts were taken as trophies. That's why he took the head off of Goliath. That was what enemies did to other enemies. As a trophy. Some of them took the genitals. So it was a trophy for the other party. When his servants told David these words, it pleased David to become the king's son-in-law. Before the days had expired, David rose up and went, he and his men, and struck down 200 men among the Philistines. Then David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. So Saul gave Michal, his daughter, for a wife. Can you imagine Saul when he gets these 200 foreskins? He was expecting that was 100 that one of the Philistines would kill David. And here comes David. Not was 100, but 200 foreskins. Like, he went over and beyond what was expected. Why? Because he wanted to honor his king. Here his king is planning to kill him, and yet David is doing everything to honor his king. Verse 28, when Saul saw and knew that Yahweh was with David and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, then Saul was even more afraid of David. The Saul was David's enemy continually. Because he says, he comes back with 200 and he's not even a scratch on this guy. Definitely Yahweh has to be on his side. So he fears that if he does something to David, that Yahweh is going to take revenge. Then the commanders of the Philistines went out to battle, and it happened as often as they went out that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so his name was highly esteemed. In other words, David gained lots of honor. Remember that in this culture, honor and shame are a huge thing. Chapter 19. Now Saul told Jonathan his son and all his servants to put David to death. But Jonathan, Saul's son, greatly delighted in David. So Jonathan told David, saying, Saul, my father, is seeking to put you to death. Now therefore, please be on guard in the morning and stay in a secret place and hide yourself. I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I will speak with my father about you. If I find out anything, then I will tell you. Then Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul, his father, and said to him, do not let the king sin against his servant David, since he has not sinned against you, and since his deeds have been very beneficial to you. For he took his life in his hand and struck the Philistine, and Yahweh brought about a great deliverance for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by putting David to death without a cause? Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan, and Saul vowed, as Yahweh lives, he shall not be put to death. So here Saul is making a vow. Remember, vows, once you make a vow, you have to fulfill it. And the vow, he's making it in the name of Yahweh. So if he goes back on his vow, basically he's saying Yahweh is false. Yahweh is not a true God that I serve. Verse 7, then Jonathan called David, and Jonathan told him all these words. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as formerly. When there was war again, David went out and fought with the Philistines and defeated them with great slaughter, so that they fled before him. Now there was an evil spirit from Yahweh on Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand. So he sits in his house with a spear in his hand. Paranoid, completely. And David was playing the harp with his hand. Saul tried to pin David to the wall with a spear, but he slipped away out of Saul's presence, so that he struck the spear into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. Can you imagine? David keeps coming and playing for this guy, and he's with a spear, and he's waiting. I think he maybe thinks he was playing darts or something. He's waiting, and in a moment that maybe David was so into his music, he throws a spear, and David flees. I mean, come on, this guy is crazy. Then Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him in order to put him to death in the morning. Right there, already he has broken the oath immediately. But Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be put to death. So Michal let David down through a window, and he went out and fled and escaped. Michal took the household idol. Now listen to this. There's an idol in the house. Michal has it. And laid it on the bed and put a quilt of goat's hair at his head and covered it with clothes. How big is this idol that it can mimic a person? Big. When Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, he is sick. Then Saul sent messengers to see David, saying, bring him up to me on his bed, that I may put him to death. When the messengers entered, behold, the household idol was on the bed with the quilt of goat's hair at his head. So Saul said to Michal, why have you deceived me like this and let my enemy go so that he has escaped? And Michal said to Saul, he said to me, let me go. Why should I put you to death? In other words, she's lying that he was going to kill her if she didn't let him go. Now David fled and escaped and came to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. I imagine Samuel going, oh my goodness, this guy doesn't learn. So David is telling Samuel everything that's going on. And he and Samuel went and stayed at Naioth. It was told Saul, saying, behold, David is at Naioth in Ramah. Then Saul sent messengers to take David, but when they saw the company of the prophets prophesying, with Samuel standing and presiding over them, the Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. When it was told Saul, he sent other messengers, and they also prophesied. So Saul sent messengers again the third time, and they also prophesied. So here he keeps sending these messengers to get a hold of David, and they wind up prophesying like the others. Then he himself, Saul, went to Ramah and came as far as the large well that is in Seku. And he asked and said, where are Samuel and David? And someone said, behold, they are at Naioth in Ramah. He proceeded there to Naioth in Ramah, and the Spirit of God came upon him also, so that he went along prophesying continually until he came to Naioth in Ramah. He also stripped off his clothes, and he too prophesied before Samuel and lay down naked all that day and all that night. Therefore they say, is Saul also among the prophets? So here, he's prophesying, but he takes off his clothes. He's naked. Now the commentaries say that this probably happened because he understands that God has stripped him of his kingship. So it's a symbolic manner as he's prophesying, he takes off his clothes because he no longer is king. So basically he's been stripped of his garments, he's been stripped of his position. So even in his prophesying, in prophecy he understands that he has been stripped of everything. Then David fled from Naioth in Ramah and came and said to Jonathan, what have I done? What is my iniquity and what is my sin before your father that he is seeking my life? He said to him, far from it, you shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing, either great or small, without disclosing it to me. So why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so. Remember that he had made a vow to Jonathan. So afterwards, he's still trying to kill David, but he hasn't told Jonathan. Because Jonathan defends David. Yet David vowed again, saying, your father knows well that I have found favor in your sight, and he has said, do not let Jonathan know this, or he will be grieved. But truly, as Yahweh lives and as your soul lives, there is hardly a step between me and death. Then Jonathan said to David, whatever you say, I will do for you. So David said to Jonathan, behold, tomorrow is the new moon, and I ought to sit down to eat with the king. but let me go, that I may hide myself in the field until the third evening. If your father misses me at all, then say, David earnestly asked leave of me to run to Bethlehem, to his city, because it is the yearly sacrifice there for the whole family. If he says it is good, your servant will be safe. But if he is very angry, know that he has decided on evil. Therefore deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into covenant of Yahweh with you. But if there's iniquity in me, put me to death yourself, for why then should you bring me to your father? So David is trying to reason with Jonathan and let him know new moon is approaching, and it was a custom that a new moon, it's a feast, okay? It's a time of celebration. They would sit down to eat, and so the king would call in his officials or people that he favored to sit at the table with the king. But David says he's not going to be there, just to wait and see if Saul is really trying to kill him or not. Verse 9, Jonathan said, far it be from you, for if I should indeed learn that evil has been decided by my father to come upon you, then would I not tell you about it? Then David said to Jonathan, who will tell me if your father answers you harshly? Jonathan said to David, come and let us go out into the field. So both of them went out to the field. Then Jonathan said to David, Yahweh, the God of Israel, be witness. When I have sounded out my father about this time tomorrow or the third day, behold, if there is a good feeling toward David, shall I not then send to you and make it known to you? If it please my father to do you harm, may Yahweh do so to Jonathan and more also. If I do not make it known to you and send you away, that you may go in safety. And may Yahweh be with you as he has been with my father. If I am still alive, will you not show me the loving kindness of Yahweh, that I may not die? You shall not cut off your loving kindness from my house forever, not even when Yahweh cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, may Yahweh require it at the hands of David's enemies. Jonathan made vow again because of his love for him, because he loved him as he loved his own life. So in a way, they're almost like renewing the covenant. So Jonathan is saying, no matter what happens, please have mercy and loving kindness towards my descendants if anything happens to me. Then Jonathan said to him, tomorrow is the new moon, and you will be missed because your seat will be empty. When you have stayed for 3 days, you shall go down quickly and come to the place where you hid yourself on that eventful day, and you shall remain by the stone Ezel. I will shoot 3 arrows to the side as though I shot a target. And behold, I will send the lad, saying, go find the arrows. If I specifically say to the lad, behold, the arrows are on this side of you, get them, then come. For there is safety for you and no harm, as Yahweh lives. But if I say to the youth, behold, the arrows are beyond you, go, for Yahweh has sent you away. As for the agreement of which you and I have spoken, behold, Yahweh is between you and me forever. So the sign is new moon, David's not there. They're going to wait to the second day, because remember that usually the feast would run, with the new moon it can go for 2 days, because usually the first night you don't see the new moon, you don't see the sliver, so they wait to the second day. So Jonathan is telling him, okay, it's by the second day he misses you, and he misses you in a nice way, then I will go outside and throw some arrows, and depending on, you will know the answer. But if my father's angry, when the young lad that I have to go get the arrows, if my father doesn't want you back, I'll say to the lad, oh, forget the arrows, just leave them there and go. Then David's going to know that it means that he needs to leave, because psycho Saul is going to go after him. Verse 24, so David hid in the field, and when the new moon came, the king sat down to eat food. The king sat on his seat as usual, the seat by the wall. Then Jonathan rose up, and Abner sat down by Saul's side. Remember that Abner is the commander of Saul's army. But David's place was empty. Nevertheless, Saul did not speak anything that day, for he thought, it is an accident, he is not clean, surely he is not clean. Remember that it has to do with ritual cleansing. They were going to sit to eat at the new moon feast. It came about the next day, the second day of the new moon, that David's place was empty. So Saul said to Jonathan his son, "Why has the son of Jesse not come to the meal either yesterday or today?" Jonathan then answered Saul, "David earnestly asked leave of me to go to Bethlehem. For he said, 'Please let me go, since our family has a sacrifice in the city, and my brother has commanded me to attend. And now, if I have found favor in your sight, please let me get away, that I may see my brothers.' For this reason he has not come to the king's table." Then Saul's anger burned against Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman." I mean, this guy is nuts. "Do I not know that you are choosing the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness?" And again, this is where people misunderstand that because it is a culture of honor and shame, when he speaks about shame, he's probably thinking, you guys are playing hanky-panky, and people misunderstand that they're having a homosexual relationship. And that's not the issue. This is why, "For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established." In other words, it's about the kingdom. He knows that David is the next one to be king. And as long as Jonathan is very favorable to David, he says, David is going to run all over you. He's going to take everything that is yours. You're not going to be king. He's going to be king. So that should be shameful to you. "Therefore now send and bring him to me, for he must surely die." But Jonathan answered Saul his father and said to him, "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" Then Saul hurled his spear at him to strike him down. So Jonathan knew that his father had decided to put David to death. Then Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger and did not eat food on the second day of the new moon, for he was grieved over David because his father had dishonored him. In other words, his father had dishonored Jonathan by doing that at the table on a new moon and still wanting to kill David, and he even throws a spear at his own son. Can you see how this anger and this jealousy has him so blinded that he's willing to kill his own son? And he does not let go of that spear. I mean, this guy must have been attached to him or something. Verse 35, "Now it came about in the morning that Jonathan went out into the field for the appointment with David, and a little lad was with him. He said to his lad, 'Run, find now the arrows which I am about to shoot.' As the lad was running, he shot an arrow past him. When the lad reached the place of the arrow which Jonathan had shot, Jonathan called after the lad and said, 'Is not the arrow beyond you?' And Jonathan called after the lad, 'Hurry, be quick, do not stay.'" He's saying this to David, but David is hiding. And Jonathan's lad picked up the arrow and came to his master. But the lad was not aware of anything. Only Jonathan and David knew about the matter. Then Jonathan gave his weapons to his lad and said to him, "Go, bring them to the city." When the lad was gone, David rose from the south side and fell on his face to the ground and bowed 3 times. I mean, David's still so humbled that he knows that Jonathan, the son of the king, he's still honoring. He's still maintaining honor. Why? Because of the position that Saul and Jonathan have. And they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the more. Jonathan said to David, "Go in safety, inasmuch as we have sworn to each other in the name of Yahweh, saying, Yahweh will be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever." Then he rose and departed, while Jonathan went into the city. So they never see each other again. But that covenant is still intact. And we'll see that later on, after Jonathan's death, that King David asked to see if there's anyone left of Jonathan's family. And there's this little guy, whatever. The guy was the ugly name that had been crippled, and so he brings him to the palace and sits him at the table to eat always. So he favors because of the covenant. Remember that covenant, especially in this time, is something you just don't break. You just always keep it through all the descendants, through all the families. Now in chapter 21, It says, then David came to Nob to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech came trembling to meet David and said to him, why are you alone and no one with you? Because remember that everybody knows what's going on between Saul and David. So here's David by himself, and the priest comes out and he's like, why are you by yourself? What's going on? You know, he's afraid too. What's, you know, probably Saul is right behind you, he's going to kill everybody. David said to Ahimelech the priest, the king has commissioned me with a matter and has said to me, let no one know anything about the matter on which I am sending you and with which I have commissioned you. And I have directed the young men to a certain place. Now therefore, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread. Again, the number 5. Number 5 has to do with kingdom. Bread has to do with the word, has to do with life, or whatever can be found. So what's going on? Remember, David is fleeing. He's fleeing without anything. Doesn't have anything on him. And so he's hungry. So he goes to the priest, because he knows about that the priests always have food. So the priest answered David and said, there is no ordinary bread on hand, but there is consecrated bread, if only the young men have kept themselves from women. Consecrated bread is the showbread, the bread that is put on the showbread table. Remember that every Shabbat is changed. And according to what they say, that the bread that is put on one Shabbat, when they take it out the next Shabbat, is as fresh as if the first day it was put there. So that's why it's consecrated bread. And only they can eat it if they have not had intercourse with a woman. Why? Because usually what would happen when men went to war, right before going to war, they would purify themselves. And they would go to war. And if they had not had sex, then they were still maintaining their cleanliness, their ritual cleanliness. And therefore they could eat the bread that was taken off the showbread table. David answered the priest and said to him, surely women have been kept from us as previously when I set out and the vessels of the young men were holy. Though it was an ordinary journey, how much more than today will their vessels be holy? So the priest gave him consecrated bread, for there was no bread there but the bread of the presence, which was removed from before Yahweh, in order to put hot bread in its place when it was taken away. So David, even though he's not a priest, he has the blessing and the privilege of eating of the showbread, which was something only for the priest. Now one of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before Yahweh, and his name was Doeg, the Edomite. Edomite, where do the Edomites come from? Edom, Esau, the brother of Jacob. Esau, Edomites. That's a bad people. So he's there, and he sees David, and he was the chief of Saul's shepherds. David said to Ahimelech, now is there not a spear or sword on hand? For I brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's matter was urgent. Then the priest said, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine whom you killed in the valley of Elah, behold, it is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you would take it for yourself, take it, for there is no other except it here. And David said, there is none like it, give it to me. So here we have, not only does he eat consecrated bread from the showbread table, he has the weapon, the sword of Goliath, who him himself killed. And remember, taken as a trophy, it was taken to the temple or the tabernacle in that time. So now he regains again the sword with which he defeated Goliath. Then David arose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. But the servants of Achish said to him, is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of this one as they danced, saying, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s? Remember that Gath is the place from where Goliath came. And these are Philistines. He went to the camp of the Philistines. He's running away from Saul. So he'd rather be with the enemy's Philistines than with Saul himself. And David took these words to heart and greatly feared Achish, king of Gath. Why? Because they say, this is David, the guy that killed Goliath, our champion. So they're not going to trust him. He's there. He came not too long ago and killed 200 Philistines and took off their foreskins. So they're afraid of him. And so they're probably, David fears that they're going to kill him because of everything that's happened. So this is what he does. So he disguised his sanity before them and acted insanely in their hands and scribbled on the doors of the gate and let his saliva run down into his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, "Behold, you see the man behaving as a madman. Why do you bring him to me? Do I lack madmen that you have brought this one to act the madman in my presence? Shall this one come into my house?" So he acts like he's nuts, he's crazy. He's dribbling and he's like, So why? So they won't kill him. They will have mercy and they will kill him because he's out of his mind. Even though he's okay, but he said, why? Because he's running away from Saul. Saul wants to kill him. So he'd rather be with enemies acting like a Looney Tunes than staying in where his family is. Even his wife is back home with his father-in-law. So up to there is this section of 1 Samuel, and now we'll do some questions.